Chapter 1, Part 2 of The Life and Letters of Elizabeth Prentiss, by George Prentiss. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Teresa Downey. Chapter 1, Part 2. Elizabeth Payson was born about 3 o'clock, so her father records it, on Tuesday afternoon, October 26, 1818. She was the fifth of 8 children, 2 of whom died in infancy. All good influences seem to have encircled her natal hour. In a letter to his mother, dated October 27th, Dr. Payson enumerates 6 special mercies by which the happy event had been crowned. One of them was the gratification of the mother's wish for a daughter rather than a son. Another was God's goodness to him in sparing both the mother and the child, in spite of his fear that he should lose them. This fear, strangely enough, was occasioned by the unusual religious peace and comfort which he had been enjoying. He had a presentiment that in this way God was forearming him for some extraordinary trial, and the loss of his wife seemed to him most likely to be that trial. God has been so gracious to me in spiritual things that I thought He was preparing me for Louisa's death. Indeed, it may be so still, and if so, His will be done. Let Him take all, and if He leaves us Himself, we still have all and abound. The next day he writes: Still God is kind to us. Louisa and the babe continue as well as we could desire. Truly my cup runs over with blessings. I can still scarcely help thinking that God is preparing me for some severe trial, but if He will grant me His presence, as He does now, no trial can seem severe. Oh, could I now drop the body, I would stand and cry to all eternity without being weary. God is holy, God is just, God is good, God is wise and faithful and true. Either of His perfections alone is sufficient to furnish matter for an eternal, unwearied song. Could I sing upon paper, I should break forth into singing, for day and night I can do nothing but sing. Let the saints be joyful, etc., etc. But I must close. I cannot send so much love and thankfulness to my parents as they deserve. My present happiness, all my happiness, I ascribe under God to them and their prayers. Surely a home inspired and ruled by such a spirit was a sweet home to be born into. The notices of Elizabeth's childhood depict her as a dark eyed, delicate little creature, of sylph-like form, reserved and shy in the presence of strangers, of a sweet disposition and very intense in her sympathies. Until I was 3 years old, mother says I was a little angel, she once wrote to a friend. Her constitution was feeble, and she inherited from her father his high-strung, nervous temperament. I never knew what it was to feel well, she wrote in 1840. Severe pain in the side, fainting turns, the sick headache, and other ailments troubled her, more or less, from infancy. She had an eye wide open to the world around her, and quick to catch its varying aspects of light and beauty, whether on land or sea. The ships and wharves not far from her father's house, the observatory and fort on the hill overlooking Casco Bay, the white mountains far away in the distance, Deering's Oaks, the Rope Walk, and the ancient burying ground. These and other familiar objects of the "dear old town," commemorated by Longfellow in his poem entitled "My Lost Youth," were indelibly fixed in her memory, and followed her wherever she went to the end of her days. In her movements she was light-footed, venturesome to rashness, and at times wild with fun and frolic. Her whole being was so impressionable that things pleasant and things painful stamped themselves upon it, as with the point of a diamond. Whatever she did, whatever she felt and did as for her life. Allusion has been made to the intensity of her sympathies. The sight or tale of suffering would set her in a tremor of excitement, and in her eagerness to give relief she seemed ready for any sacrifice, however great. This trait arrested the observant eye of her father, and he expressed to Mrs. Payson his fear lest it might some day prove a real misfortune to the child. She will be in danger of marrying a blind man, or a helpless cripple, out of pure sympathy, he once said. But by far the strongest of all the impressions of her childhood related to her father. His presence was to her the happiest spot on earth, and any special expression of his affection would throw her into ecstasy of delight. When he was away, she pined for his return. The children all send a great deal of love, and Elizabeth says, "Do tell papa to come home," wrote her mother to him when she was 6 years old. Her recollections of her father were singularly vivid. She could describe minutely his domestic habits, how he looked and talked as he sat by the fireside or at the table, his delight in and skillful use of carpenter's tools, his ingenious devices for amusing her and diverting his own weariness as he lay sick in bed, for example, tearing up sheets of white paper into tiny bits, then letting her pour them out the window to make believe it snowed, or counting all the bristles in a clothes brush, and then as she came home from school holding it up and bidding her guess their number. His coolness and efficiency in the wild excitements of a conflagration, the calm deliberation with which he walked past the horror stricken lookers on, and cut the rope by which a suicide was suspended, these and other incidents she would recall a third of a century after his death, as if she had just heard of or just witnessed them. To her child's imagination his memory seemed to be invested with the triple halo of father, hero, and saint. A little picture of him was always near her. She never mentioned his name without tender affection and reverence. Nor is this at all strange. She was almost 9 years old when he died, and his influence during these years penetrated to her inmost being. She once said that of her father's virtue only one, punctuality, had descended to her. But here she was surely wrong. Not only did she owe him some of the most striking peculiarities of her physical and mental constitution, but her piety itself, if not inherited, was largely inspired and shaped by his. In the whole tone and expression of her earlier religious life, at least, one sees him clearly reflected. His devotional habits, in particular, left upon her an indelible impression. Once, when 4 or 5 years old, rushing by mistake into his room, she found him prostrate upon his face, completely lost in prayer. A short time before her death, speaking of this scene to a friend, she remarked that the remembrance of it had influenced her ever since. What somebody said of Sarah Coleridge might indeed have been said with no less truth of Elizabeth Payson. Her father had looked down into her eyes and left in them the light of his own. The only records of her childhood from her own pen consist of the following letters, written to her sister while the latter was passing a year in Boston. She was then 9 years old. Portland, May 18th, 1828. My dear sister, I thank you for writing to such a little girl as I am, when you have so little time. I was going to study a little catechism which Miss Martin has got, but she said I could not learn it. I want to learn it. I do not like to stay so long at school. We have to write composition by dictation, as Miss Martin calls it. She reads to us out of a book, a sentence at a time. We write it, and then we write it again on our slates, because we do not always get it the whole. Then we write it on a piece of paper. Miss Martin says I may say my Sunday school lesson there. Mr. Mitchell has had a great many new books. I have been sick. Dr. Cummings has been here, and says E. is better, and he thinks he will not have a fever. G. goes to school to Miss Libby, and H. goes to Master Jackson. H. sends his love. Good bye. Your affectionate sister, E. Payson. September 29th, 1828. My dear sister, I think you were very kind to write to me when you have so little time. I began to go to Miss Petrie's school a week ago yesterday. I stay at home Mondays in the morning to assist taking care of Charles, or such little things as I can do. G. goes with me. When mother put Charles and him to bed, as soon as she had done praying with them, G. said, "Mother, will this world be all burnt up when we are dead?" She said, "Yes, my dear, it will." "What, and all the dishes too? Will they melt like lead? And will the ground be burnt up too? Oh, what a nasty fire it will make!" I saw the Northern Lights last night. I sleep in a very large, pleasant room in the bed with mother. I have a very pleasant room from my baby house over the porch, which has 2 windows and a fireplace in it, and a little cupboard, too. E. Wood and I are as intimate as ever. I suppose you know that Mr. Wood is building him a brick house. Mrs. Merrill's little baby is dead. It was buried yesterday afternoon. Mr. Mussey lives across the street from us. He has a great many elm trees in his front yard. His house is 3 stories high, and the trees reach to the top. We have heard 2 or 3 times from E. since he went away. Yesterday all the Sabbath schools walked in a procession, and then went out to our meeting house, and Mr. William Cutter addressed them. I am your affectionate sister, E. Payson. Her feeble constitution exposed her to severe attacks of disease, and in May, 1830, she was brought to the verge of the grave by a violent fever. Her mother was deeply moved by this event, and while recording in her journal God's goodness in sparing Elizabeth, wonders whether it is to the end that she may one day devote herself to her Saviour and do something for the honor of religion. In the later part of 1830, Mrs. Payson removed to New York, where her eldest daughter opened a school for girls. It was during this residence in New York that Elizabeth, at the age of 12 years, made a public confession of Christ, and came to the Lord's table for the first time. She was received into the Bleecker Street, now the 4th Avenue, Presbyterian Church, then under the pastoral care of the Reverend Erskine Mason, D.D., May 1, 1831. Toward the close of the same year the family returned to Portland. In a letter addressed to her husband, one of Mrs. Prentiss's oldest friends now living, Miss Julia D. Willis, has furnished the following reminiscences of her early years. While they confirm what has been said about her childhood, they are especially valuable for the glimpses they give of her father and mother and sister. The Willis and Payson families were very intimate and warmly attached to each other. Mr. Nathaniel Willis, the father of N. P. Willis, the poet, was well known in connection with the Boston Recorder, of which he was for many years the conductor and proprietor. Both Mr. and Mrs. Willis cherished the most affectionate veneration for the memory of Dr. Payson. So long as she lived, their home was a home to Mrs. Payson and her daughters whenever they visited Boston. As a preacher, Dr. Payson could not fail to make a strong impression even on a child. Years ago, in New York, I once told Mrs. Prentiss, who was too young at her father's death to remember him well in the pulpit, that the only public speaker who ever reminded me of him was Edwin Booth in Hamlet. I surprised, and, I am afraid, a little shocked her. But it was quite true. The slender figure, the dark, brilliant eyes, the deep earnestness of tone, the rapid utterance combined with perfect distinctness of enunciation, in spite of surroundings the best calculated to repel such an association, recalled him vividly to my memory. My father's connection with the religious press, after his removal from Portland to Boston, brought many clergymen to our house, who often, in the kindness of their hearts, requited hospitality by religious conversation with the children, not church members, and presumably, therefore, impenitent. I did not always appreciate this kindness as it deserved, and often exercised considerable ingenuity to avoid being alone with them. In Dr. Payson's case, I soon learned, on the contrary, to seek such occasions. I was sure that before long he would look up from his book or his manuscript and have something pleasant or playful to say to me. His general conversation, however, was oftener on religious than on any other subjects, but it was so evidently from the fullness of his heart, and his vivid imagination afforded him such a wealth of illustration, that it was delightful even to an impenitent child. Years afterward, when I read in his memoir of his desponding temperament, of his seasons of gloom, of the sense of sin under which he was bowed down, it seemed impossible to me that it could be my Dr. Payson. I visited Portland, and was an inmate of his family at the commencement of the illness that finally proved fatal. He was not confined to his bed or to his room, but he was forbidden, indeed unable, to preach, unable to write or to study. He could only read and think. Still he did not shut himself up in his study with his sad thoughts. I remember him as usually seated with his book by the side of the fire, surrounded by his family, as if he would enjoy their society as long as possible. And the children's play was never hushed on his account. Nor did he forget the young visitor. When the elder daughter, to whom my visit was made, was at school, he would care for my entertainment by telling a story, or propounding a riddle, or providing an entertaining book to beguile the time till Louisa's return. Among the group in that cheerful room I remember Lizzie well, a beautiful child, slender, dark eyed, light footed, very quiet, evidently observant, but saying little, affectionate, yet not demonstrative. One evening during my visit, Mrs. Payson not being quite well, the elders had retired early, leaving Louisa and myself by the side of the fire, she preparing her school lesson, and I occupied in reading. The lesson finished, Louisa proposed retiring, but I was too much interested in my book to leave it, and promised to follow soon. She left me rather reluctantly, and I read on, too much absorbed in my book to notice the time till near midnight, when I was startled by hearing Dr. Payson's step upon the stairs. I expected the reproof which I certainly deserved, but though evidently surprised at seeing me, he merely said, "You here? You must be cold. Why did you let the fire go out?" Bringing in some wood, he soon rekindled it, and began to talk to me of the book I was reading, which was one of Walter Scott's poems. He then spoke of a poem which he had been reading that day, Southey's "Curse of Kehama." He related to me with perfect clearness the long and rather involved story, with that wonderful memory of his, never once forgetting or confusing the strange Oriental names, and repeating word for word the curse: "I charm thy life from the weapons of strife, from stone and from wood and from fire and from flood, from the serpent's tooth and the beasts of blood. From sickness I charm thee, and time shall not harm thee," etc., etc. I listened, intent, fascinated, forgot to ask why he was there instead of in his bed, forgot that it was midnight instead of midday. It was not till on bidding me good night he added, "I hope you will have a better night than I shall," that it occurred to me that he must be suffering. The next day I learned from his wife that when unable to sleep on account of his racking cough, he often left his bed at night, the cough being more endurable when in a sitting posture. I never saw Dr. Payson after that visit, nor for several years any of the family except Louisa, who spent a year with us while attending school in Boston, to fit herself as a teacher to aid in the support of her younger brothers and sister. When I was next with them, Louisa was already at the head of a school in which her young sister was the brightest pupil, and to the profits of which she laid no personal claim, all going untouched into the family purse. Several young girls, Louisa's pupils, had been received as boarders in the family, and occasionally a clergyman was added to the number. It was during this visit that I first learned to appreciate Mrs. Payson. Now that she stood alone at the head of the household, either her fine qualities were in bolder relief, or I, being older, was better able to estimate them. The singular vivacity of her intellect made her a delightful companion. Then her youth had been passed in the literary circles of New Haven and Andover, and she had much to tell of distinguished people known to me only by reputation. I admired her firm yet gentle rule, so skillfully adapted to the varying natures under her charge; her conscientious study of that homely virtue, economy, so distasteful to one of her naturally lavish temper, always ready to give to those in need to an extent which called forth constant remonstrances from more prudent friends; her alacrity also in all household labors, which the more excited my wonder, knowing the little opportunity she could have had to practice them amid the wealth of her father's house before the embargo, which later wrecked his fortune with those of so many other New England merchants. She was, indeed, of a most noble nature, hating all meanness and injustice, and full of helpful kindness and sympathy. No woman ever had warmer or more devoted friends. Both at this time and in subsequent visits, as she advanced from childhood to girlhood, I remember Lizzie well, although my attention was chiefly absorbed by the elder sister of my own age, my principal companion when present, and correspondent when absent. The two sisters were strongly contrasted. Louisa, as a child, was afflicted with a sensitive, almost morbid shyness and reserve, and an incapacity for enjoying the society of other children whose tastes were uncongenial with her own. The shyness passed with her childhood, but the sensitiveness and exclusiveness never quite left her. Her love of books was a passion, and she would resent an unfair criticism of a favorite author as warmly as if it were an attack on a personal friend. To Lizzie, on the contrary, a friend was a book which she loved to read. Human nature was her favorite study. There seemed to be no one in whom she could not find something to interest her, none with whom there was not some point of sympathy. Combined with this wide and genial sympathy was another quality which helped to endear her to her companions, viz., an entire absence of all attempt to show her best side, or to put the best face on anything that concerned her. An ingenuous frankness about herself and her affairs, even about her little weaknesses, was one of her most striking traits. No one, indeed, could know her without learning to love her dearly. Yet if I should say that in my visits to Portland Lizzie always appeared to me preeminently the life and charm of the household, it would not be exactly true, though she would have been so of almost any other household. The Payson family was a delightful one to visit. All were so bright, and in the contest of wits that took place often between Lizzie and her merry brothers, it was sometimes hard to tell which bore off the palm. I do not know that I ever thought of her at that time as an author. If any one had predicted to me that one of the group would be the writer of books which would not only have a wide circulation at home, but be translated into foreign languages, I should certainly have selected Louisa, and I think most persons who knew them would have done the same. The elder sister's passion for books, her great powers of acquisition, the range of her attainments, embracing not only the modern languages and their literature, but Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, her ability to maintain discussions on German metaphysics and theology with the learned professors, all seemed to point her out as the one likely to achieve distinction in the literary world. I do not remember whether it was Lizzie's early contributions to the Youth's Companion, showing already the germ of the creative power in her, or her letters to her sister, which first suggested to me that the pleasures her friends found in her conversation might yet be enjoyed by those who would never see her. Louisa had given up her school for the more congenial employment of contributing to magazines and reviews, and of writing children's books, and as the greater literary resources of Boston drew her thither, she was often for months a welcome guest at our house, where she first met Professor Hopkins of Williamstown, and whom she afterward married. The letters which Lizzie wrote to her at those times were never allowed to be the monopoly of one person. We all claimed a right to read them. The ease with which in these she seemed to talk with her pen, the mingled pathos and humors with which she would relate all the little joys and sorrows of daily life, leaving her readers between a smile and a tear, showed the same characteristics which afterward made her published writings so much more generally attractive than the graver ones of her elder sister. But Louisa's failing health soon after her marriage, and the long years of suffering which followed, prevented her ever doing justice to the expectations her friends had formed for her. The occasion of my next visit to Portland was a letter from Mrs. Payson to my mother, who was her constant correspondent, in which she spoke sadly of an indisposition she feared was the precursor of serious illness, but which chiefly troubled her on account of Lizzie's distress that her school prevented her being constantly with her mother. An offer on my part to come and take her place in her hours of necessary absence was at once accepted. Mrs. Payson's illness proved less serious than had been feared, and once more I passed several pleasant weeks in that house. But the pleasantest hours of the day were those in which Lizzie, returning from school, sat down at her mother's bedside and amused her with her talk about her pupils, their various characters, and the progress they had made in their studies, or related little incidents of the schoolroom with her usual frankness, not omitting those which revealed some fault, or what she considered such on her part, especially her impulsiveness that led her often to say things she afterward regretted. As an example, one of her pupils was reading in French to her, and coming to the expression "Mon Dieu," so common in French narratives, had pronounced it so badly that Lizzie exclaimed, "Mon Dieu! He would not know himself what you meant." The laugh, which it was impossible to repress, did not diminish her compunction at what she feared her pupils would regard as irreverence on her part. I believe I always cherished sufficient affection for my teachers, and yet I was not a little astonished on accompanying Lizzie to school one day to see, as we turned the corner of a street, the rush of girls with unbonneted heads to greet their young teacher for whom they had been watching, and escort her to her throne in the schoolroom, and evidently in their hearts. For a year or two after this visit I have no recollection of her, or indeed of any of the Payson family. Death, meanwhile, had been busy in my own home, and my memory is a blank for anything beyond that sad circle. Since that date you have known her better than I. I wish that these recollections of a time when I knew her better than you were not so meagre. If we were not thousands of miles apart, and I could talk with you instead of writing to you, perhaps they would not appear quite so unsatisfying. Yet, trivial as they are, I send them in the persuasion that any trifle that concerned her or of hers is of interest to you. Geneva, Switzerland, February 1st, 1879. End of Chapter 1, Part 2. Recording by Teresa Downey.